Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is a video, or maybe it's a podcast, about designing better miniature games. My name's Mike. I design miniature games. Some of them have been published. This guy's called Glenn. Say hello, Glenn.
Hello.
Glenn also designs miniature games as well as other kinds of games. We were, last time we published, talking about the different sorts of user interfaces that you might provide to your players as you're thinking about designing a miniature game. I really like this stage of developing and designing a game because I think that the way that you present the information to the players and the little bits of paper or card or whatnot that you give them kind of has a lot to do with how, particularly initially, they enjoy the game or engage with the game or remember the game. And I think that getting it right can be a delightful way of sort of injecting some of the flavor and colorfulness into the game. So to rewind a little bit, one of the things that we were talking about is how the game's information can be presented to you, the player, in a few different ways. And one of them is that there's going to be some user interface that exists entirely inside your brain, the sort of naming of rules, the organizing of the rules, the structuring of the game. That stuff has to make sense and click inside your brain. And then there's the little tactile pieces like the dice and the miniatures and the movement widgets and the tape measures and whatever that you have to use to manipulate to play the game. And then there's the purely visual stuff of the quick reference sheet and maybe the unit cards or other bits and bobs that there might be arrayed around on the table, like the tokens and so forth. And quite often there's a relationship between all three of them. Quite often tactile things are providing some kind of user interface, or the user interface cards you can scribble on to make them tactile, and they're all making references to the mental rules anyway. But I promised and trailed last time we spoke that I would talk a little bit about Saga, because I've been working on a game called Pacific Command, which I talked about a little bit on the Man Battle Stations podcast, if you want to go and check out Man Battle Stations, episode 81. So I'm happy doing a mild criticism of Saga because Glenn has talked at length about how much we like that game.
It is a splendid game.
And we don't like to poo-poo on other games, but it's often useful to talk about some of the observations about other games if you're going to, you know, learn things and be critical about them. We tend to focus on our own games. But anyway, all of that preamble aside, one of the things that I found recently playing Saga Age of Magic, and I had played Saga a few times, like 3-4 years ago, but the game wasn't super familiar to me. I was learning the second edition. There's quite a lot of new rules or additional rules in Age of Magic that I was also trying to learn at the same time. And what I found in that game is that I was flipping around the rulebook quite a lot for some pretty, what seems to me, basic information. And I had to keep looking up the same couple of things, like what is the basic stats for a couple of the odder, newer types of units? And what does these two special rules do? And why aren't they listed in the special rules section? And why isn't the special rules section in alphabetical order? Because I keep losing one of the rules because it starts with a B, but it's buried on the like 14th sort of entry in this list of rules. And why it's noteworthy to me is that I think Saga represents fundamentally one of the best user experiences in miniature war games, which is the battle board, which is a incredibly lovely combination of tactile, mental and visual UI that just does this tremendous job of like explaining the core loop of the game and getting you to interface and interact with it in this really physical and sort of direct way. But it doesn't have like unit cards or even a decent quick reference table for the unit stats. And it doesn't provide me any way of like assembling my army in a way that becomes like this really easy to look at reference sheet where I don't lose all of the numbers. And so what I ended up was, even though it's got this beautiful UI, I actually came away from the game being a bit frustrated because the experience was that I had to keep flicking through the rulebook. And I get that criticism a lot about flicking through rulebooks. And I hate that criticism because I know that I can do better. I just don't know how to do better with the rulebook. And so recently I was messing around with Pacific Command and trying to come up with a sort of A5 sheet that will summarize in this game, you'll basically have 3, 4, 5 units. They're called task forces, and they're quite complicated units. Like, think about a Titan or a mech in BattleTech. Like, those are quite complicated things with lots of weapon systems and lots of damage and lots of all these kinds of little subsystems going on. And I like that. And because that's a complicated thing, like, those tend to have a user interface contained on a fairly chunky card. And I think, as an aside, it's quite interesting when you go back and look at Manowar and you find the size of the cards is about the same size as a Titan or a mech in BattleTech, and it absolutely didn't need to be. It could probably have been a tiny little playing card size, and in fact, you could probably get 3 ships of the line on a single card, but they just went really big. So user interface error there, but it was the early 90s. We can forgive them that.
I like the space. I like the space to operate.
No, I get it, but like in that case, like putting a little putting a fairly reasonably sized fire token on a location could have been a red dot with a pen or a check in a box. So I was working on this sort of task force reference card for Pacific Command, and realizing that if I built something in like a spreadsheet, I could get it so that you could sort of populate the weapon systems or the other ships that are in the system, and then it would populate the stats, and it would even add up some stats where I'm creating a slightly complicated sort of the attack dice you roll is the sum of the weapon systems, which are basically the ships in your task force. And thinking how nice it would be to make this like there's a sort of complicated setup during army building where I'm choosing this stuff, but that the result of that is that I just write down some simple numbers onto a piece of cardboard, a piece of paper, and that becomes a really simple thing to interact with on the table, such that, you know, checking off damage or checking off blown up ships sort of makes it obvious when things are changing or what numbers need to affect. So I think that the question of like unit cards and army rosters seems to me under considered.
Yeah, I think one thing that's significant, and it popped up in the previous conversation, you were talking about playing A Billion Suns and physically what you wanted to do to note credits and things. And I think it's a significant point to say, and we'll have a conversation. I'm intending us to have a conversation about physically prototyping, but I think it's relevant to say physically prototype early, get to the tabletop early, and see what you're missing when you sort of stand there and start interacting with the game. See where you want to put tokens and dice. See, like, when I've got to remember this number, what do I do? Well, I'm picking up a dice and I'm putting it there. Okay, I mean, that's what I want to do. That's maybe what I should interact with. It's like the game I'm working on at the moment, Puke Apocalypse, where we had a very early test game, and I wanted the puke tokens to be like on the table, and Mike was immediately, I'm putting them on my character sheet. I don't want them on the table. And it's like, yeah, that was right. You know, they should be there at this point, and then they should be on the table at that point. And sort of,
right, they're in my tummy, so they're on my character sheet. They're thrown up on you and all over the ground, so they're on the table.
Yeah, and sort of the sooner you physically get things onto the tabletop, and the sooner you start realizing that it feels very different when you write down where to put something and how to operate it from when you actually do it. And you want to try and find the intuitive ways of sort of physically operating things on the tabletop, because those are the ways that they're going to most easily remind people and they're going to interact with most sort of effortlessly. So yeah, I think sort of early prototyping, early sort of physically getting onto the tabletop. I think it's funny sort of you mentioning Saga there, because I think that Saga is an example of a game that was written for learning rather than referencing, and also a game that sort of they haven't gone back and reconsidered that as they've added in sort of more and more stuff. Because it's like, of course they aren't super paying attention to the like units for quick reference card, because originally there were 3 units and they had like, you know, 2 or 3 stats each. Nobody needed a quick reference system for that. You know, that literally by the end of my first game, I already had in my head the the way those 3 units worked. And then, you know, we got a few more characters added in, and then a few more bits added in, and a few more special rules added in. And by the time you get to Age of Magic, you've got quite a few units and quite a few rules.
And it's still a pleasingly simple game, and it's very simple for what it's trying to achieve. It's just that it's now crossed over the path into, yeah, I probably need to just see all this information in one place so that I don't have to flip around.
Well, I think it's also it's such a popular game, and one that sort of gets people and keeps them to fans for so long, that what's happened is that every sort of 6 to 12 months, your mate has wandered over and gone, oh, there's one additional unit. You're remembering 3, remember a 4th one. Well, that's fine. I've got those 3 engraved on my skull at this point. A 4th one's no problem. And then they've done it again, and then a new person wanders in, and it's like, okay, we just have to memorize these 12 things. Like, you know, and it's like, reconsider maybe as things. And I think this is why one of the many reasons, and there are many reasons, it's super important to like do blind play testing whenever you can with your game, because you have every part of your game is like engraved on your heart. It's branded onto you. It's as natural as breathing. The sort of the 27 different unit types that have 15 different actions each. Like, well, obviously it's unit 18B and it's 37th action. Why would you even struggle to remember this? Because you've built it up by drips all the way through. And when you present that to a total stranger, you know, I sometimes pick up rule sets, you know, from the sort of in development, and I look at them, I'm just like, oh God, I mean, I'm quite good at rule sets, but this is terrifying. I don't want to touch this. It's too much, you know, and find a way to guide me through that sort of.
Well, and I think that's one of the things where like character sheet style, like, you know, a warband roster or whatever, is quite nice, because the act of transcribing for some people will again like lock in certain things or provide a kind of, you know, a trigger for memory, and also like can provide then, you know, the fact that I've kind of boiled down from all the possible rules complexity. I've sort of said, this is the part that I will look at. I'm just going to box off this stuff that I need to know about, and I'm not going to worry about the giant mess of everything else. I just grabbed something off my shelf to double check, because I seemed to remember it and kind of confirmed it. So one place that I think is a good example of this is in Frostgrave. So Frostgrave has got a couple things that it's got like 3 areas that are quite complicated, but they're all you get like photocopyable stuff UI in the book for all of these things, like the wizard and the apprentice and all the things that happen to them through the campaign is important. And the book provides a wizard sheet with all the stuff that you'd kind of, it looks like an RPG character sheet. Like it's got, you know, it's got things about like what's in your home base and what's in your treasury and which, you know, magic items have you got and so forth. And then there's a separate set of things for writing down all the soldiers and gang members that you've hired. But then critically, because obviously the first time you try and build a wizard, you're like, oh my God, there are so many spells. How am I going to do this? Critically, he also provides not very beautiful, but incredibly functional magic cards, so that every spell has got a little card that you can print out, and then choosing your spells is as easy as cutting these out with a pair of scissors and choosing the ones that you want. And so like everything that you need to play the game in Frostgrave is sort of thrown at you, and with a pencil you then go and, okay, so it's got to, you know, I'll write down the stats for the ranger and I'll write down the stats for the barbarian and so forth, and that kind of helps you ring fence the rules that you need to worry about, and then also provides you with this way of looking at it that's super game usable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so, yeah, so they're talking about, you know, cards, and I think there's a significant difference again, I think, between a quick reference sheet or quick reference page in a book and a quick reference card. So, you know, you'll often want the spells, for example, you know, in a game to be on a card to be able to pick up and look at. You might sort of have taken a few spells out of the lore in a way that you don't really want the specific spells you're casting to be on a quick reference sheet. You want the method of casting to be on a quick reference sheet, and you want whatever happens when
right. And there's a tactile element to isolating that, because then I can put it next to the model that cast it or is carrying the spell, or I can put it on the target that it's going to, you know, to remind myself that it's got, you know, feat of strength for the next one turn or whatever. So that like that affordance of, is the position of this piece of information important or not?
Yeah,
Like for a long time in Hobgoblin, I wanted Hobgoblin to have some historicals have this. Like I wanted Hobgoblin to have little fillable cards where like I can put the card behind the unit and it says the thing it has there to hit row, and it has the, like, you know, place for you to write their things in. I may still do that before the end of the print run, but like the point being that like there's a tiny unit card and I want it to be near the unit that it is. Which is kind of strange because like most time I actually have unit cards, I array them off the table so that I've got quick reference for them, which might be the reason that I haven't done this. Other people in some historicals have done it where they poke out from underneath and they expect you to write it down on like the edge of it and then slide it under the unit, which is quite nice.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things, I think again, one of the things about cards being sort of more natural to pick up and hold. This is something I've noticed a few times, is that you usually get your spells on sort of reference cards because you want to pick them up and you want to mutter and consider them as you're looking at the tabletop, because these are your options, they belong to you and you get to choose how to interact with them. Whereas whenever somebody picks up the quick reference sheet and looks very closely at it while muttering and looking at the table, I feel like I have the right to go, what do you think?
Those are shared rules. There oughtn't to be anything in there that's surprising.
Yeah, you shouldn't be looking that closely and thinking about something. And I do think that's a very real thing, is that, you know, the tactile nature of cards, of reference cards, tell you that this is something that you can pick up, you can own as your bit of the game, which is very different to a quick reference sheet. If a lore of magic is written on a page of a rule book, it feels like it should sit on the tabletop open and people should be able to look at it. If it's printed on some cards, it feels like you should be able to pick them up and you know, and I think that the tactile nature of the way that people interact with the bits of your user interface are super sort of educational, as it were. You need to sort of think about how we deal with things. We hold cards in a very specific way, we fan them in a certain way, we want to keep them face down. It's like you can give people reference cards that have open information and they will put them face down. You know, that everybody knows what's on that card. You showed the other person what's on that card and they will naturally just pop it face down. You're like, but that's to remind you of something. It's really inconvenient putting it face down. It's just hardwired into you that you've got your card, it goes face down and other people don't see it. And playing with those things and sort of tweaking them. And I think it's why, like, so in relation to the tactile sort of bits of the game, the dice, the cards, the tokens, is when you're deciding whether something should maybe be done with a card or maybe should be done with a dice, think a little bit about how people normally interact with that object. Think about the sorts of behaviors you're leveraging with them and what they want to do with it, apart from the sheer convenience of it, of like, you know, if I'm doing a wound counter, I want it to be a dice because the numbers are already there, whereas I don't want to do it with a card because I have to take that card out and put a new one in. But think about like what people want to do with dice when they pick them up. Think about what people want to do with cards when they pick them up. Think about what people think about tokens. Tokens operate in a very different way. Tokens are meant to be dropped onto the table, you know, next to the miniature. They're meant to note things. They're meant to sit on reference.
Well, and so I think like that I think gets us into one of the interesting elements that I think quite often the tactile UI doesn't, not everyone like completely answers this question in their game designs, and I'm not certain that I always do either, but like what part of the UI is your responsibility as the game designer to provide, and which parts is it just okay to say, and you need this to track this thing or the location of this thing or the number of these things. Because like going back to Frostgrave, it makes some really interesting and I think quite deliberate decisions on this topic, where like there's a couple of things, tactile things in the game that you absolutely need. Like you need treasure tokens. The game does not function without treasure tokens. But there aren't a little set of treasure tokens to cut out in the back of the book, even though there's loads of other things in the back of the book to cut, stick, and mend and make. And I think that's because Joe's saying, no, treasure tokens are cool and fun models that you should worry about as much as you should worry about the wizard in your warband. Go to town, have a good time. but you will need to make them. Whereas like Joe also says, and I'm not sure everyone does this, but like Joe says, use a pen and use a pencil and an eraser to track wounds on all of your models. Don't put dice on the table. And he does that by providing a quick reference sheet for all your soldiers, which has a box that says current wounds in it. So you literally get a space in the UI to write down something that otherwise you'd have had to provide a solution for. And I'm sure everybody tracks it in different ways. I use dice and count down, and so, other people will do all kinds of other things and so forth. But the point is, a specific and deliberate decision has been made about what UI component is your responsibility as the player versus provided by the games designer, as opposed to something like Malifaux, which has this really, really sort of honking problem in the middle of it, which is it has a ton of status effects that provide absolutely no guidance about how to track them, and created this whole like cottage industry of laser cut token printing because there were just way too many of them, and you had to poison and fire, and they did all kinds of different special ones for each master and so forth. And that's interesting as well because the game provides these beautiful laminated, like shiny gloss cards that has all the rules that you need, and it's beautifully laid out, and they've been incredibly thoughtful about the fact that on your turn the passive effects are on one side of the card, and when it's the other person's turn you turn it over and all the active effects on it. It's absolutely incredibly thought out, and you can dot the wound counts along on the front of it. And yet there's this huge blind side about the fact that like you get to the table and the first thing you do is you choose your missions, and it's like, okay, I've got to lay a bunch of tokens out for this, that, and the other. Where are they? Oh crap, like I'm stuck. Okay, right, now we have to like do some poison and like how do I track that? Well, there's not even a space on the card to write the damn effect on. Like it's really interesting. I'm not necessarily throwing shade there. I'm just saying like this question of what is your responsibility to at least provide an idea of what the intended user interface for tracking or registering it is, I think is really worth thinking about, because a lot of games skim over it and it ends up costing mental overhead and friction at the table where you could have just provided an answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one thing where you're whatever a Malifaux or a Guild Ball, where there is going to be a cottage industry of people who provide very lovely bespoke solutions to these problems. But if you're not, and there aren't people who are getting like status rings for your game, people to drop around their miniatures, then you're really giving people a hard time to sort of deal with some of this stuff. I mean, I remember when I sort of picked up a Guild Ball team, and it was like, oh, you'll also need these tokens and counters and cards and widgets and things. And I really absolutely have my heart sort of drop through my shoes on that. It just makes me feel like, I don't think maybe this is a game for me. I tell you,
right. Whereas you could have maybe just had a little piece of paper that you printed and cut out, and every time you played a game you maybe printed another one.
I tell
Black and white character sheets for the win.
I tell you one thing that I've been using recently that I think should just be in everything is a measuring widget. I made a sort of measuring widget for one of the games I'm testing, and every time I go to measure anything while I'm playtesting Puke Apocalypse, I'm just picking up that widget because it's just infinitely better than.
Is it a 1, 2, 3 inch widget?
It's in this particular case, it's 4, 3, 2, 1. Going around it, and I think this is an interesting one because it's like you sometimes throw in numbers for distances as you're writing, just like 8 inches sounds about right, 6 is probably okay, 4, I don't know, 3 maybe, and stopping and going, okay, right, well maybe I'd like to give people like a measuring tool. Should I sort of consider holding myself to certain bands of measurement and going, well, look, I've got a whole bunch of 3 and 4 inches. Does it matter if they're all just 4 inches, or should this 8 inch be 6 inches? And I think it's worth
right. And the answer to that is definitely not obvious, because part of the wonder of these non-discrete games is the fact that you can create all kinds of wonderful scenarios, and so having models that move different things does create that sort of spectrum.
Well, we always have the option of up to 4
that's true
on a measuring widget, but it is sort of like what are the upper limits of our up to that we're setting? And if I've arbitrarily put in 6, 7, and 8 inches where 6 and 8 inches would do. And similarly, I think in reference to the sort of the tracking of statuses in things like Malifaux, I think there is an opportunity at some point for somebody somewhere to go, do we really need all of these statuses, guys? I mean, look at, these are the tokens that we need to track. If I had all of the statuses running in a given game, this is, and it was the end of second edition. I was already at the point of like, oh my, you could legitimately have like 9 different tokens noting the entirely different states all on the tabletop at one time. That's too many. Somebody somewhere should have gone, guys, let's say 6. 6 is the most. Beyond that, and I think it's also, one of the things about tokens and counters and such like, which is a sort of something to think about and make a decision about, is do they get put on the table or do they get put on character cards or something off to one side?
Yeah.
Where do you want people to put them? What will the table look like if they do the thing you didn't want them to do? Because and I think people have different points of view. Some people love a clean tabletop with no tokens on them. Some people like to be able to read the state of the table at a glance. I much prefer to be able to read the table at a glance. I think
that's an interesting point just to catch on and double underline, because I think one of the things that people initially assume is a clear table is an elegantly designed game. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. Like, it's not necessarily the case that your design goal should be a pristine table that's completely free from non-diegetic information and elements, and the only thing that should be on the table is scale models interacting with scale terrain. Because, as you say, like, some people just like to look at a table and go, it's got 3 wounds left. That's important. I don't want that hidden over there. That piece of information is absolutely critical to every decision I make with regard to that unit.
Yeah, and I think it's one of these things where, like, models are one of the potentially a big user interface piece to these games. If you've got a table full of single wound models, you can instantly tell which things have been wounded because they get taken off once they're wounded. It's very intuitive. It gives a lot of information. On a slight side note, there's a Kickstarter that I just love the idea of, a thing called I Am Ronin, which is totally based on the idea of 3D printing. And in that, your samurai has different stances through combat, and when he moves to his next stance, which gives him different bonuses and abilities, you switch the mini out for the different one in the different stance.
Outrageous.
And I've mentioned it on the Roundup channel because I love that somebody's done that, and it's like, I don't know if it's super effective, but I want that to exist. I want more.
Right, asking the question, do you want to play this game well enough to paint the same model 5 times so that you can play it fully painted? Listen, I feel like there's probably another conversation in miniatures as UI and all the things that emerge from that I'm kind of surprised we haven't already covered. So we should put that on the backlog.
We have touched on it. I mean, I think we've touched on the majority, I think, of the user interface points in these 2 conversations for now. Unless there's something specific you'd like to hit on before we round up.
No, I think that's it. More printable black and white user interfaces for armies and characters and so forth.
Take serious consideration about what it is like to interact with your game, where information is noted, how people have the information presented to them. Read some graphic design books or blogs if you're not already sort of educated in that area. It's super useful. Make efforts and pains to give people what they need to play your game. That shouldn't be that shouldn't need citation. That should be like, well, yeah, obvs. But I know we live in a sort of make do and mend sort of area of things where people are expected to get together the dice and get together the tokens, but think about how they're going to do that. Think about how to ease it for them, and think about how to tell them what to get together, and how, don't just say note things with a token. Tell them what sort of token. Tell them why it's significant that it's that sort of token. Give people the tools they need to play your game. If there is a tactile element of a game, we've mentioned, games that have too many counters. What's the exact right number of counters? Which game had the exact right number of counters? What was exactly right
Oh,
about?
Glenn, I didn't even get a chance to rant about Conan, the board game with the little fatigue system with the 3 boxes that you move gems between. Ah, that's an incredible system for tracking miniature things.
What is your favorite system for tracking information in a game? How is it done? Did they do it in a tactile sort of element of things? The Frostgrave boxes make me think of the stamina boxes in fighting fantasy books. That's why I like them. What will your user interface reference? What's your favorite reference or callback within a user interface? That there's some little Easter eggs you've enjoyed while playing a game and thought, I know what he wants me to think of at this point.
How many hitboxes for a mech's torso is the correct number?
Drop down into the comments section and give us your answer to these questions and more. Run over to the Discord while you're doing it and bellow these numbers at me without context and then run away again. Hit the like and subscribe buttons.
Please do. We need to feed the algorithm.
The algorithm is hungry.
It needs to hear your voice.
Stand
up and be counted. Press the like button.
It's so nearly sated. But for now, it's going to be a thank you and a goodbye from this episode of Rule of Carnage. So we'll say thank you and goodbye. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Bye. It looks like a fake arm that I'm wiping around.